Every visit, every look, every silence at the dinner table. It all started the day she saw me in heels. She thought it was a phase. She thought she could shame it out of me. But what happened next didn't just change her opinion. It changed my marriage, my confidence, and my life forever. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why I never went back. The first thing I felt wasn't shame. It was the sharp awareness that someone was staring at me with a disappointment they'd been rehearsing for years. I stood there in the hallway, the mirror behind me like a silent accomplice, knowing before I turned around exactly who it was and exactly what she was thinking. My mother-in-law had that look perfected, lips pressed thin, eyes scanning not just my clothes but my intentions, my worth, my right to exist in the room as I was. I could almost hear the sentence forming in her head, the one she'd never stop repeating no matter how calmly she spoke it aloud. This is not what I raised my daughter to marry. I hadn't dressed this way to provoke her. That was the cruel irony. I dressed this way because for once, I wanted my outside to stop lying about my inside. The dress wasn't dramatic. The makeup wasn't bold. Everything about me was careful, restrained, like I was asking the world for permission rather than making a statement. And still, it was enough to ignite something old and unmovable in her. My wife squeezed my hand without looking at either of us. That small gesture carried more weight than any argument ever could. It told me I wasn't alone, even if I was about to be misunderstood. Again. The mirror caught my reflection at an angle, half confidence, half fear, and I realized this wasn't just about clothes. This was about boundaries. About who gets to define me. About how much of myself I was willing to lose just to keep the peace. Her silence stretched, heavy and intentional. I felt 12 years old again, bracing for disapproval I hadn't earned. Except this time, I didn't look away. I could feel my mother-in-law's gaze even when she finally looked away, like it had left an imprint on the room. She busied herself with her purse, with a coat rack, with anything that allowed her not to acknowledge what was right in front of her. That avoidance hurt more than an outburst would have. Anger you can answer. Silence just sits there, rewriting the story without your consent. As we moved into the living room, I became hyper-aware of my body, the way the fabric moved when I walked, the way my posture shifted as if my spine were negotiating a ceasefire between pride and fear. Every step felt deliberate, like I was learning how to occupy space again under new rules. I caught my reflection in the glass of a framed photo on the wall. A distorted version of me stared back, curved by the surface, but still unmistakably present. The image steadied me. Even warped, I existed. Even uncomfortable, I was real. My wife started a conversation about something mundane, her voice calm, almost intentionally ordinary. I understood what she was doing, building a bridge of normalcy so I wouldn't feel like a spectacle. I loved her for that. But I also knew normalcy had limits. Sooner or later, the unsaid would demand a voice. When my mother-in-law finally spoke, it wasn't loud. It was controlled. Are you comfortable like that? The question wasn't curiosity. It was judgment wearing polite clothes. I took a breath before answering, aware that whatever I said would echo far beyond the room. Yes, I said simply. And in that moment, I felt both terrified and strangely free. The word hung there. Yes, fragile and defiant all at once. I'd never answered a question from her so plainly before. Usually, I softened myself around her, padded my sentences with reassurance, with explanations I didn't owe. This time, I let the truth stand on its own, unaccompanied. Her reaction was subtle but sharp. A small inhale through the nose. A nod that wasn't agreement, just acknowledgement. I could almost see the internal filing cabinet opening, this version of me being placed carefully into a drawer labeled problem. I felt my chest tighten, an old reflex urging me to backpedal, to clarify that this wasn't permanent, or political, or anything that might threaten her idea of order. But another voice, quieter, steadier, asked why my comfort always needed footnotes. The mirror across the room caught my eyes again. I looked steadier than I felt. That mattered. My mother-in-law sat down with the stiffness of someone preparing for a long wait. "I just don't understand," she said at last, not to me, but to the space between us. "Why would you choose this?" There it was. The assumption that this was a choice, like a hobby picked up late in life. I thought of all the mornings I'd stood in front of my closet feeling like I was selecting armor instead of clothing. Of all the evenings I'd changed quickly, quietly, erasing myself before anyone could notice. If this was a choice, it was the first one that hadn't felt like self-betrayal. "I didn't choose to feel like this," I said carefully. "I chose to stop hiding it." Her eyes flicked to the mirror, then away again. The room felt smaller, heavier. But beneath the tension, something else stirred, resolve. Because for the first time, I wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's discomfort. The conversation drifted after that, not because anything had been resolved, but because tension has a way of exhausting everyone in the room. My mother-in-law turned her attention to the television, volume a little too high, as if noise could substitute for understanding. I sat quietly, hands folded in my lap, noticing how unfamiliar that position felt now, less like submission, more like patience. Inside, memories kept rising uninvited. The first time I'd ever tried on something that felt true and immediately panicked. The years I'd convinced myself it was a phase, a quirk, something I could outgrow if I just tried harder to be who people expected. I realized how much energy that had taken, how much of myself I'd spent just maintaining the illusion of ease. My wife caught my eye and smiled, small but steady. That smile reminded me that love doesn't always look like agreement from everyone in the room. Sometimes it looks like quiet solidarity when things get uncomfortable. I stood up to help with tea, needing movement, needing to remind myself I wasn't trapped. As I walked past the mirror again, I noticed something new. I wasn't scanning myself for flaws anymore. I wasn't wondering how ridiculous I looked through someone else's eyes. I was just checking that I was still there. In the kitchen, alone for a moment, I rested my hands on the counter and breathed. Fear was still present, but it no longer felt like a warning sign. It felt like a companion I'd learned how to walk beside instead of run from. I knew then that whatever came next, with her, with the family, with the world, I couldn't undo this step. And strangely, that thought didn't terrify me. It grounded me. When I returned to the living room with the tea, the air felt altered, like a storm that hadn't broken but had changed the pressure in the room anyway. My mother-in-law thanked me without looking up. Polite. Distant. The kind of courtesy that builds walls instead of bridges. I told myself not to mistake manners for acceptance or rejection for truth. As I handed my wife her cup, our fingers brushed. That tiny contact sent a surprising surge of strength through me. It reminded me that this wasn't a solo journey, even when it felt isolating. I sat back down, shoulders relaxed despite the part of me that expected correction at any moment. My mother-in-law finally spoke again, voice measured. "What will people think?" There it was, the question that had governed so much of my life without ever being spoken out loud. I stared at the tea for a second, watching the steam curl upward and disappear. A perfect symbol, I realized, for opinions. Visible, fleeting, impossible to hold on to. "I used to think about that all the time," I said. "It made me smaller. Quieter. I don't want to live like that anymore." She looked at me then, really looked, as if searching for something familiar to anchor herself to. I wondered if she saw defiance or sadness, or a stranger wearing a face she recognized but didn't know how to read anymore. The mirror across the room reflected the three of us together, imperfectly aligned, sharing the same space but not the same understanding. Still, we were there. Still, I hadn't disappeared. And that felt like a victory I didn't need her permission to claim. Her question lingered long after the words settled, echoing in places I hadn't realized were still hollow. I'd spent years letting what will people think steer my choices like an invisible hand on my back. Hearing it spoken aloud felt like confronting an old ruler. I was finally ready to retire. My mother-in-law sighed, a sound heavy with frustration and something softer underneath it. Fear, maybe, or loss. I just don't want you making life harder than it already is, she said. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was kind, but because it was familiar. I'd told myself the same thing for years, using comfort as a reason to stay silent. It was already hard, I replied gently. This is just honest. The room grew quiet again, but this silence was different. Less sharp. More contemplative. I noticed how my hands rested naturally now, no longer clenched, no longer apologizing. The mirror caught that detail, and I held on to it like proof. Later, as we prepared to leave, my mother-in-law stood near the door, arms crossed, eyes searching my face one last time. For a moment, I thought she might say something that would undo all the progress I felt inside. Instead, she simply nodded. Not approval. Not rejection. Just acknowledgement. As we stepped outside, cool air brushing my face, I felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to my eyes. I hadn't won her over, but I hadn't lost myself either. And for the first time, that balance felt possible. The drive home was quiet, not awkward, just full. The kind of silence where thoughts finally get room to stretch. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, briefly illuminating my reflection in the window, faint, layered over the night outside. I studied it the way you study a memory while it's still forming, unsure which details will last. I replayed her words in my head, not to argue with them, but to understand why they still carried weight. I realized how deeply I'd wanted her approval, even knowing it might never come. Wanting acceptance from someone who disapproved of your existence felt like chasing a horizon. Exhausting. Endless. My wife reached over at a red light and rested her hand on my knee. I'm proud of you, she said, softly, like she didn't want to break something delicate. That was the moment the tension I'd been holding finally loosened. Not all at once, but enough to breathe. I hadn't needed to convince anyone. I just needed to show up as myself and stay. At home, I went straight to the bedroom and stood in front of the mirror again. The lighting was harsher here, less forgiving, but I didn't flinch. I saw traces of the evening in my expression. Fatigue, resolve, a quiet kind of pride. I realized that every difficult conversation left a mark, and not all of them were scars. Some were contours, shaping you into someone more solid. I changed slowly, folding my clothes with care instead of urgency. The act felt intentional, respectful. Not like hiding, more like preserving something meaningful. As I turned out the light, I understood something that surprised me. Her disapproval no longer felt like a verdict. It felt like information. And information, unlike judgment, could be lived with. The next morning, I woke with the strange sensation that something important had shifted while I wasn't looking. Not vanished. Settled. Like a decision my body had made before my mind caught up. I lay there listening to the house wake up, replaying the night not with dread, but with a kind of measured curiosity. Getting dressed took longer than usual. I stood in front of the mirror, clothes draped over the chair, and noticed how my instincts had changed. I wasn't asking what will cause the least friction anymore. I was asking what feels honest today. That question felt radical in its simplicity. The mirror reflected my hesitation, then my resolve. I chose carefully, calmly, and when I was finished, I didn't rush away from my reflection. I let myself look. I let myself recognize the person standing there, not defiant, not fragile, just present. Later that day, a message came through from my mother-in-law. Short, polite, neutral. No mention of clothes. No mention of understanding. And oddly, that was okay. I realized I didn't need immediate resolution to feel steady. Some bridges take time. Some people need distance to recalibrate. What mattered was that I hadn't folded myself away afterward. I hadn't punished myself for making someone uncomfortable. The old reflex was still there, whispering, but it no longer had the final word. As the day went on, I caught my reflection in windows, in screens, in passing moments. Each time, I felt a small, grounding reassurance. I was still here, still choosing myself. Days passed, and the tension didn't disappear, it transformed. It became something quieter, more manageable, like a low note humming beneath everything else. I found myself replaying moments from that visit, not to relive the discomfort, but to study my own reactions. I noticed how I hadn't apologized, how I hadn't laughed it off, how I'd stayed. At work, in public, in ordinary interactions, I felt more aware of myself than ever before. Not self-conscious, self-present. There's a difference. I walked differently. I listened more closely to my own instincts. The mirror motif followed me everywhere, even when there was no glass around. Every choice felt like a small reflection. Was I hiding, or was I being kind to myself? One afternoon, while sorting laundry, I paused with a familiar garment in my hands. The fabric felt symbolic now, less like an object and more like a chapter marker. I didn't rush to put it away. I folded it carefully, deliberately, acknowledging what it represented. Not rebellion, not defiance, but alignment. I thought about my mother-in-law then, about how fear often dresses itself up as concern. I wondered what mirrors she avoided in her own life, what versions of the world she was protecting herself from. The thought softened something in me. Understanding didn't excuse the hurt, but it made room for patience without surrender. That evening, I stood in front of the mirror again and said something out loud I'd never dared before. Not a declaration, just a truth. I'm allowed to exist like this. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They settled. The next family gathering loomed in my mind long before it appeared on the calendar. I could already feel the familiar tightening in my chest, the instinct to pre-edit myself for comfort, everyone else's comfort. But something had changed. The fear was still there, yes, but it no longer felt like a command. It felt like a question asking how brave I was willing to be today. When the day came, I dressed slowly, intentionally. Not dramatically, not cautiously, just honestly. The mirror reflected someone who knew the risks and chose presence anyway. I noticed how my expression had softened over time, how my eyes no longer darted away as if expecting correction. That steadiness felt earned. The gathering itself was uneventful in the way real turning points often are. Conversations overlapped. Laughter rose and fell. My mother-in-law was cordial, measured, distant, but not hostile. The absence of confrontation felt heavier than conflict ever had. It left space for my own thoughts to echo. At one point, our eyes met across the room. No glare, no warmth, just recognition. And in that quiet exchange, I understood something important. I didn't need her to approve of me to continue. I just needed to stop shrinking in anticipation of her disapproval. Later, as we said our goodbyes, she hesitated, then said, "You seem calmer." It wasn't acceptance, but it was observation. And for the first time, I realized progress doesn't always look like agreement. Sometimes it looks like being seen without being erased. On the drive home, I caught my reflection in the dark window again, layered over passing lights, and smiled. Small, private, real. That comment stayed with me longer than I expected. Calmer. I turned it over in my mind the way you turn a stone in your pocket, feeling its weight from different angles. Calm hadn't come from approval or compromise. It had come from consistency, showing up as myself often enough that my own nervous system finally believed I wasn't in danger. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how much energy I used to spend rehearsing defenses that never got used. Without that constant vigilance, there was room for other things: patience, humor, a quieter confidence. The mirror reflected these changes in ways I couldn't fake. relaxed shoulders, steadier breath, a face that looked less like it was bracing for impact. My mother-in-law and I spoke occasionally. The conversations were careful, bounded, but civil. I stopped measuring each exchange for signs of conversion or condemnation. I let them be what they were. Boundaries, I learned, aren't walls. They're doors you decide when to open. One afternoon, while sorting through old photos, I found an image of myself from years ago, smiling, but tight, like the smile had been borrowed. I held it up to the mirror and saw the difference immediately. Not better or worse. Just more honest now. The realization brought a swell of emotion I hadn't expected. Grief for the years I'd spent negotiating my own existence, and pride for the courage it took to stop. That night, as I turned off the light, the mirror faded into darkness. I didn't feel watched. I felt accompanied. The truth I arrived at wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't announce itself with certainty or slogans. It settled in slowly, like learning the weight of your own name after years of answering to something else. I understood that my mother-in-law might never like how I dressed, might never reconcile the person she expected with the person standing in front of her. And for the first time, that knowledge didn't feel like a threat. I stood in front of the mirror one evening, the house quiet, the day finally exhaling. The reflection looking back at me wasn't asking for permission or bracing for judgment. It was simply present. The mirror, once a source of doubt, had become a witness to consistency, to the courage of repetition. Showing up again and again as myself had softened the sharpest edges of fear. I thought about how many lives are shaped by other people's discomfort, how often we mistake tolerance for safety and silence for peace. I thought about my wife's steady hand, my own steadier breath, and the realization that self-acceptance isn't a destination you reach, it's a practice you return to, even when it's inconvenient. If my mother-in-law hated that I dressed like a woman, that was her story to carry. Mine was simpler now. Mine was about honesty, about choosing alignment over approval, about finally recognizing myself without flinching.